Get your supervisor. I want this man fired. Today. The TSA checkpoint, usually a low hum of beeping scanners and shuffled bins, went almost dead silent. A woman in a cream-colored travel suit stood at the far end of the X-ray belt, one hand gripping a rolling suitcase like it contained state secrets, the other pointed accusingly at a TSA officer who couldn't have been more than 25, his expression somewhere between professional patience and genuine confusion. "Ma'am, I was simply doing a standard secondary inspection," he said. "The scanner flagged an anomaly in the lining of your bag." "There is nothing wrong with my bag," she snapped. "You people have no right to go digging through someone's personal belongings like this is some kind of interrogation." I was standing 3 checkpoints down, shoes half off, watching this unfold with the specific fascination that only a delayed security line can produce. Because here's the thing, I could see, from where I stood, exactly what the officer was holding up. A hidden zipper. One nobody puts in a suitcase by accident. Hey, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I fly enough that I've genuinely lost count of how many security checkpoints I've shuffled through in my life, shoes off, laptop out, liquids in a tiny bag, the whole ritual. And over the years, I've noticed something. Nowhere does entitlement collide with actual rules faster than a TSA checkpoint, where the officer in front of you has zero authority to bend, and every incentive to follow procedure exactly. Today's story is about a woman I'm calling HOA Karen, because, you guessed it, she brought up her homeowners association credentials within the first 15 minutes, as if running a neighborhood board somehow qualified her to override federal security protocol. This is a story about a secret compartment, a young officer who did his job exactly right, a very public meltdown, an investigation that moved faster than anyone expected, and a final twist that turned "get him fired" into something she almost certainly regretted saying out loud. If you love airport chaos and satisfying karma stories, you're in exactly the right place. Stick around, and if you enjoy this one, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Let me back up, because I want to paint the full picture of how ordinary this morning started. I was flying out for a long weekend to visit an old friend, nothing complicated, a short domestic flight, carry-on only, the kind of trip where you can genuinely show up to the airport with minimal stress because there's no checked baggage to worry about, no tight connection to sweat over. I'd gotten to the airport with a comfortable buffer of time, grabbed a coffee, and joined the security line in that pleasant, low-stakes headspace you're in when a trip is simple and everything's going according to plan. The security checkpoint that morning was busy but moving steadily, the kind of controlled chaos TSA lines usually are, with the low murmur of instructions, the beeping of metal detectors, the rhythmic thump of bins being stacked and res-tacked. I'd gone through this exact process more times than I could count, and honestly, my brain mostly runs on autopilot for it at this point. Laptop out, liquids out, shoes off, phone in the bin, walk through, collect everything on the other side, put shoes back on, move along. I remember thinking, as I set my bin on the belt, that this was shaping up to be a wonderfully uneventful morning. I had no idea that about 30 feet ahead of me, a woman was about to turn a routine secondary bag check into one of the most memorable security line standoffs I'd ever witnessed. I set my bin down, started unloading my laptop and the small clear bag of liquids I always keep pre-packed in my carry-on for exactly this purpose, and glanced around at the usual mix of travelers doing the same, a businessman shrugging out of his blazer, a family with 2 kids trying to keep track of 3 separate backpacks, a college student in headphones who clearly hadn't looked up from his phone since he'd joined the line. Completely ordinary morning chaos, the kind you stop even registering as chaos after you've flown enough times. I remember checking the departures board reflected in a nearby monitor, doing the quick mental math frequent flyers do automatically, plenty of time before boarding, no reason to rush, no reason to stress. It's a genuinely nice feeling, that particular calm of knowing a trip is starting smoothly. I had absolutely no idea how quickly that calm was about to evaporate for a large chunk of that checkpoint, myself included, once things really got going up ahead. I noticed her while I was still waiting to load my own bin, mostly because of how she was speaking to the TSA officer directing traffic at the front of the line, sharp, clipped, the tone of someone who considers basic instructions beneath her. Let's call her Vivian. Mid-50s, immaculately put together in a cream travel suit that seemed designed more for a boardroom than a boarding gate, dragging a hard-shell suitcase that looked brand new, and radiating the specific kind of impatience that comes from someone who has clearly never once in her life been told to simply wait her turn. "Can we move this along? I have a flight to catch," she said to the officer directing the line, despite the fact that everyone in line had a flight to catch, and despite the fact that the line was, by any reasonable measure, moving at a completely normal pace. When her bag went through the X-ray scanner, I watched the officer monitoring the screen, the young man from the hook scene, pause, lean in slightly, and flag something to his colleague. Nothing dramatic. Just the quiet, procedural moment that happens dozens of times a day at any checkpoint, where a scan shows something that needs a closer look. "Ma'am, we're going to need to do a secondary check on this bag," he said, pulling it aside to the inspection table. "Absolutely not," Vivian said immediately. "I don't have time for this. Do you know who I am?" Nobody did. And that, somehow, only seemed to make her angrier. It's a strange thing to watch in person, someone genuinely expecting a stranger's name recognition to change the outcome of a procedural security check. The officer, for his part, didn't even blink at the question, which told me he'd probably heard some version of, "Do you know who I am?" more times than he could count. He simply repeated, calmly, that the bag needed a secondary check, and gestured toward the inspection table like this was the most routine request in the world, because, for him, it absolutely was. A few people in line behind Vivian exchanged glances, and I caught the eye of the businessman a few spots ahead of me, who mouthed, silently, "Here we go," with the weary recognition of someone who'd clearly witnessed this exact type of standoff before. "Ma'am, I understand this is frustrating, but this is standard procedure when the scanner flags something," the officer said, already snapping on a pair of gloves. "It'll only take a few minutes if you cooperate." "I run my community's homeowners association," Vivian said, apparently deciding this was the moment to establish her credentials. "I know exactly how these procedures are supposed to work, and singling out one passenger for an invasive search is not it. It's not personal, ma'am. The X-ray flagged a dense area in the lining of your suitcase that needs to be checked. There is nothing in my suitcase but clothing," she said, voice climbing. This is exactly the kind of overreach I deal with constantly from people who think a little bit of authority makes them untouchable. The officer, to his credit, didn't rise to it at all. He simply unzipped the main compartment, methodically checking through folded clothes, toiletry bags, the usual contents of a normal suitcase, and then paused near the base of the bag, running his hand along the interior lining until he found what the scanner had actually flagged, a seam that didn't quite match the rest of the stitching, with a nearly invisible zipper pulled tucked into the fabric. "Ma'am, is this bag modified in any way?" "That's an internal design feature. It's not a secret compartment, if that's what you're implying." The way she said, "secret compartment," quickly, defensively, before anyone had actually used that phrase, was the exact moment I realized this line was about to get very interesting. While the officer continued his inspection, a strange ripple of smaller issues started happening throughout the surrounding checkpoint area, small enough that nobody connected them at first, but odd enough to notice individually. A man 2 lines over realized his phone, which he'd placed in a bin moments earlier, had somehow ended up shoved beneath a stack of other passengers' bins on the conveyor belt, delayed and nearly missed on the other side. A woman near the front had her boarding pass, tucked into her passport, apparently slip out and vanish for several tense minutes before it turned up folded oddly inside a nearby empty bin. And strangest of all, an elderly traveler waiting near the inspection table reported that a small jewelry pouch, which he'd removed from his carry-on per instructions and placed briefly on the edge of the table, had gone missing entirely, right around the same time Vivian, mid-argument, had reached over, to grab a tissue, from her own bag sitting nearby. None of these incidents seemed connected to a casual observer. But several of us near the inspection area had clearly noticed Vivian's hands moving more than her ongoing argument with the officer really required, small, restless movements near other people's belongings whenever attention shifted away from her, even briefly. The woman standing next to me in line, an off-duty nurse heading home from a conference, murmured, "Is anyone else watching her hands right now?" I was. And apparently, so was security. There's a specific kind of tension that builds in a security line once people start quietly noticing the same suspicious pattern independently of each other, not panic exactly, more like a shared, unspoken alertness. Nobody wanted to be the one to make an accusation without being sure, but you could feel the collective attention in that section of the checkpoint sharpening, the way it does right before something gets confirmed instead of just suspected. I found myself watching the inspection table more closely than I probably would have on any normal day, half out of genuine concern for the elderly traveler's missing pouch, half out of the same morbid curiosity that keeps you glued to a situation you know is about to escalate. I didn't have to wait long to find out I was right. TSA checkpoints, much like most secure areas of any airport, are covered extensively by camera systems, a fact most travelers barely think about, but one that becomes extremely relevant the moment something unusual starts happening in a high-traffic security zone. Once the elderly traveler reported his missing jewelry pouch, a nearby supervisor was flagged, and within a couple of minutes, a small team had gathered near the monitoring station just off the checkpoint floor, quietly reviewing footage from the cameras covering the inspection table area. The footage was clear enough that they didn't need long. It showed Vivian, mid-argument with the young officer, reaching subtly toward the edge of the inspection table while gesturing dramatically with her other hand, a classic misdirection move, intentional or not, and sliding the small jewelry pouch into the outer pocket of her own carry-on. Separately, while reviewing the footage, the supervisor also noticed something else worth flagging. Vivian's earlier claim that the hidden compartment was simply an internal design feature didn't match what the scanner data was showing. The density readings from the initial X-ray were consistent with something specifically packed to avoid standard detection, not clothing, not toiletries, but something deliberately concealed. The supervisor made a call to bring in an additional officer trained specifically in secondary inspections involving concealed compartments, standard procedure whenever initial findings suggest something beyond an ordinary bag search. By the time the additional officer arrived, Vivian had escalated her demands considerably, insisting loudly that the entire checkpoint had targeted her unfairly and that she wanted the young officer's name, badge number, and immediate termination for what she called harassment of a law-abiding citizen. "Ma'am, before we go further," the supervisor said, holding up a tablet, "can you explain this?" The footage played, clear as day, showing her sliding the elderly passenger's jewelry pouch into her own bag. Vivian's face went through the now familiar sequence, a flicker of panic, quickly buried under fresh outrage. "That's completely taken out of context. I thought that pouch was mine. It's an easy mistake in a chaotic environment like this. It has his name embroidered on it, ma'am," the supervisor said, turning the pouch over to show a small monogram stitched into the fabric. A murmur rippled through the surrounding line. The elderly traveler, arms crossed, simply said, "That's not an easy mistake." The secondary officer, meanwhile, had opened the hidden compartment properly, using specialized tools designed exactly for this purpose. Inside, carefully wrapped, were several bundles of cash, well beyond the amount that would raise no concern on its own, but combined with the deliberate concealment and the way it had been packed specifically to avoid detection, it triggered an entirely separate level of protocol that had nothing to do with a simple bag inspection anymore. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for further screening," the supervisor said, his tone shifting from procedural to unmistakably serious. "This is an absolute disgrace," Vivian announced, loud enough for the entire checkpoint to hear now, her voice carrying that particular pitch reserved for people who believe volume can substitute for being right. "I demand this officer be fired for violating my privacy, and I demand—" "Ma'am, you were just recorded taking another passenger's property, and your bag contains a concealed compartment with undeclared currency," the supervisor said, unmoved. "This is well beyond a privacy concern at this point. I run my community's homeowners association," Vivian said again, apparently still convinced this credential carried some kind of universal authority. "I know exactly how to escalate misconduct when I see it." "This isn't your homeowners association, ma'am," the supervisor replied, echoing almost exactly the same line I'd heard used on Karens in similar stories before, and I swear at least 6 people near me actually laughed out loud. "She took that man's jewelry right in front of us, the off-duty nurse standing near me said, loud enough to be heard clearly. I watched her do it. So did I, said another voice from further back in line. Vivian's composure, already cracking, seemed to fully give way under the accumulating weight of witnesses. You're all making this into something it isn't, she said, though her voice had lost most of its earlier bite. The young officer, who'd remained mostly quiet through the entire escalation, finally spoke up, calm and steady. Ma'am, I flagged a scanner anomaly and followed procedure exactly as trained. I'm sorry you're upset, but I didn't do anything wrong here. That line got a small, spontaneous round of applause from the surrounding line, the kind that happens when a room full of strangers all silently agree at once. Cornered and thoroughly humiliated in front of a checkpoint full of witnesses, Vivian didn't back down. If anything, she doubled down harder. She pulled out her phone, insisting she was going to post this everywhere, and expose what she called a power-tripping security team abusing its authority over an innocent traveler. She began narrating dramatically into her camera, painting herself as a victim of an unprovoked, invasive search, conveniently leaving out the part where she'd been recorded taking another passenger's belongings in plain sight. She turned to the crowd one more time, trying to rally sympathy. Does anyone else think this is excessive treatment over a simple travel accessory in my bag? Nobody answered. The elderly traveler simply held up his now-recovered jewelry pouch, monogram clearly visible, and said nothing at all, which somehow landed harder than any verbal response could have. When the crowd's sympathy didn't materialize, Vivian tried appealing directly to authority one more time, insisting she wanted to speak to someone in charge of the entire airport, not just checkpoint staff, as if escalating the audience for her complaint might somehow change the facts already documented on camera. The supervisor, patient but firm, explained that airport administration would absolutely be involved, though not in the way Vivian seemed to be hoping for. Given the concealed currency, the attempted theft, and her continued refusal to cooperate calmly, the situation had moved well past a simple checkpoint dispute and into something requiring formal law enforcement involvement. 2 airport police officers arrived within minutes, alerted by the checkpoint supervisor once the situation had clearly escalated beyond standard TSA authority. They reviewed the footage, spoke briefly with the young TSA officer and his supervisor, and then approached Vivian directly. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us, one of the officers said. You're being detained pending an investigation into concealed currency violations and an attempted theft. This is insane, Vivian said, but her voice had lost nearly all its earlier force, replaced by something closer to genuine alarm as the reality of the situation started sinking in. I have a flight to catch. You're not catching this flight, ma'am, the officer replied simply. As she was escorted away, suitcase and all, toward the airport police office for further processing, the young TSA officer who'd started the whole thing simply exhaled, shook his head slightly, and returned to his station without a word, no gloating, no reaction beyond quietly getting back to work, which somehow made the whole thing land even more satisfyingly for everyone who'd watched it unfold. The elderly traveler, jewelry pouch safely back in hand, caught the officer's eye and gave him a small, grateful nod. The officer nodded back, and the line, remarkably, started moving again almost immediately, like the entire checkpoint had collectively exhaled along with him. The rest of us moved through security in the strange, buzzing aftermath that follows a shared unbelievable experience, that specific kind of temporary camaraderie strangers develop after witnessing something wild together. The off-duty nurse and I ended up walking toward the same terminal wing, comparing notes on the whole ordeal, both of us still slightly stunned by how quickly things had escalated from checking a suitcase to airport police investigation. The elderly traveler, once through security himself, stopped to personally thank the young officer again before heading toward his gate, and I overheard him telling another passenger nearby that it was the best customer service I've ever gotten at an airport, hands down. A few of us gave brief statements to airport police before continuing on, confirming what we'd witnessed regarding the jewelry pouch and Vivian's behavior throughout the confrontation. It felt like a small thing in the moment, but knowing the full picture was properly documented mattered to me, this wasn't just an entertaining story to tell later, it was something that could genuinely affect whether that young officer's professionalism got the recognition it deserved instead of an unfair complaint sitting on his record. I made my flight with time to spare, the whole story feeling almost unreal by the time I buckled my seatbelt, and I spent a good chunk of the flight texting friends the play-by-play, several of whom responded with a variation of, "There's no way that actually happened," which, understandably, is the exact reaction this story tends to get. What sticks with me most about this whole encounter is how it started as something almost mundane, a routine scanner flag, a standard secondary check, and how quickly it spiraled once Vivian decided that being questioned at all was somehow an unforgivable offense rather than simply part of how airport security works for everyone, without exception. The young officer never raised his voice, never deviated from procedure, and never let her escalating accusations rattle him into cutting corners or backing down from doing his job correctly. That kind of calm, consistent professionalism is easy to overlook when nothing dramatic is happening, but it's exactly what allows a system like airport security to actually function fairly for the thousands of people who pass through it every single day. The broader lesson here isn't really about Vivian, or even about TSA procedures specifically. It's about what happens when someone assumes that authority and status back home somehow exempt them from basic accountability everywhere else. Eventually, that assumption runs headfirst into a system built specifically to treat everyone the same way, and when it does, the consequences tend to land a lot harder than the minor inconvenience they were originally trying so hard to avoid. So here's my question for you: if you've been standing in that line, watching a woman demand a young officer be fired just for doing his job correctly, would you have spoken up in the moment the way several of us did, or just watched quietly and let it play out? Let me know in the comments, and if you've ever watched someone try to pull rank on airport security, or witnessed a TSA officer handle a difficult situation with impressive patience, I'd genuinely love to hear that story too. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you're subscribed, because trust me, Vivian was not the last Karen I've encountered at a checkpoint, and she definitely won't be the last one on this channel. Thanks so much for sticking around for the whole story. I know these run long, but every detail matters when you're trying to actually understand how something this wild unfolds in real time. If you want more airport chaos and karma stories like this one, this channel's the place for it. See you in the next video.